Chapter 7. Her Majesty's Ranch. 5 months brought all that Stillwell had dreamed of, and so many more changes and improvements and innovations that it was as a touch of magic had transformed the old ranch. Madeline, Alfred, and Florence had talked over a fitting name, and had decided on one chosen by Madeline. But this instance was only one in the course of developments in which Madeline's wishes were not complied with. The cowboys named the new ranch Her Majesty's Ranch. Stillwell said the names cowboys bestow were facetious and as unchangeable as the everlasting hills. Florence went over to the enemy, and Alfred, laughing at Madeline's protest, declared the cowboys had elected her queen of the ranges and that there was no help of it, and so the name stood Her Majesty's Ranch. The April sun shone down upon a slow rising green knoll that nestled in the lee of the foothills, and seemed to center bright rays upon the long ranch house, which gleamed snow-white from the level summit. The grounds around the house bore no semblance of the eastern lawns or parks. There had been no landscaping gardening. Stillwell had just brought water and grass and flowers and plants to the knoll top, and there had left them, as it were, to follow nature. His idea had been crude, but the result was beautiful. Under that hot sun and the balmy air, with cool water daily soaking into the rich soil, a green covering sprang into life, and everywhere upon it, as if by magic, many colored flowers rose to the sweet air. Pale wild flowers, lavender daisies, frail bluebells, and white four-petaled lilies, like eastern mayflowers, and golden poppies, deep sunset gold, color of the west, bloomed in happy confusion. California roses, crimson as blood, nodded heavy heads and trembled with the weight of bees. Low down, in bare places, isolated, open to the full power of the sun, blazed the magenta blossoms of the cactus plants. Green slopes led all the way down to where new adobe barns and sheds had been erected, in wide corrals stretching high barred fences down to the great squares of alfalfa, gently inclining to the gray of the valley. The bottom of the dammed-up hollow shone brightly with its slowly increasing acreage of water, upon which thousands of migratory wild fowl swirled and splashed and squawked, as if reluctant to leave this cool, wet surprise so new to the long desert journey to the north land. Quarters for the cowboys, comfortable, roomy adobe houses that not even the lamest cowboy dare complain about crampy bunks, stood in a row along a long bench of ground above the lake, and down to the edge of the valley the cluster of Mexican habitations in the little church showed the touch of the same renewing hand. All that had been left of the old Spanish house, which had been Stillwell's home for so long, was the bare, massive structure, and some of this had been cut away for new doors and windows. Every modern convenience, even to hot and cold running water and acetylene light, had been installed, and the whole interior painted and carpentered and furnished. The ideal sought had been not luxury but comfort. Every door into the patio looked out upon dark, rich grass and sweet-faced flowers, and every window looked down the green slopes. Madeline's room occupied the west end of the building and comprised 4 in number, all opening out into the long porch. There was a small room for her maid, another which she used as an office, and then her sleeping apartment, and lastly, the great light chamber which she had liked so well upon first sight, and which now, simply yet beautifully furnished and containing her favorite books and pictures, she had come to love as she had never loved any room at any house. In the morning, the fragrant, balmy air blew the white curtains of the open windows, At noon, the drowsy, sultry quiet seemed to creep in for a siesta that was characteristic of the country. In the afternoon, the westering sun peeped under the roof and painted the walls with gold bars that slowly changed to red. Madeline Hammond cherished a fancy that the transformation she had wrought in the old Spanish house and in the people with whom she had surrounded herself, great as that transformation had been, was nothing compared to the one wrought in herself. She had become an object in life. She was busy. She worked with her hands as well as mind, yet she seemed to have more time to read, to think, and study, and idle and dream than ever before. She had seen her brother through his difficulties, on the road to all the success and prosperity that he cared for. Madeline had been a conscientious student of ranching and an apt pupil of Stillwell. The old cattleman, in his simplicity, gave her the place in his heart that was meant for the daughter he had never had. His pride in her, Madeline thought, was beyond reason or belief or words to tell. Under his guidance, sometimes accompanied by Alfred and Florence, Madeline had ridden the ranges and had studied the life and work of the cowboys. She had camped on the open range, slept under the blinking stars, ridden 40 miles a day in the face of dust and wind. She had taken 2 wonderful trips down into the desert, one trip to Chihuahua and from there across the wasteland of sand and rock and alkali and cactus to the Mexican border, in the other through the arc of Pella Valley with its deep and red-walled canyons and wild fastness. This breaking in, this training into Western ways, though she had been so-called an outdoor girl, had required great effort and severe pain. But the education, now past its primary grades, had become a labor of love. She had perfect health, abounding spirits. She was so active that she had to train herself into taking the midday siesta, a custom of the country, and was imperative during the hot summer months. Sometimes she looked in her mirror and laughed with sheer joy at sight of the lithe, brown-faced, flash-eyed creature reflecting there. It was not so much joy in her beauty as a sheer joy of life. Eastern cities had been wont to call her beautiful in those days when she had been pale and slender and proud and cold. She laughed. If they could only see her now. From the tips of her golden head to her feet she was alive, pulsating, on fire. Sometimes she thought of her parents, sisters, friends, and of how they were persistently refused to believe she could or would stay in the West. They were always asking her to come home, and when she wrote, which was dutifully enough, the last thing under the sun she was likely to mention was the change in her. She wrote that she would return to her own home some time, of course, for a visit, and letters such as this brought returns that amused Madeline, sometimes saddened her. She meant to go back east for a while, and after that once or twice every year, but the incentive was a difficult step from which she shrank. Once home, she would have to make explanations, and these would not be understood. Her father's business had been such that he could not leave it for the time requiring of a Western trip, or else, according to his letter, he would have come for her. Miss Hammond could not have driven to cross the Hudson River, and her un-American idea of the wilderness westward was that the Indians were still chasing buffalo on the outskirts of Chicago. Madeline's sister Helen had long been eager to come, as much from curiosity, Madeline thought, as from sisterly regard. At length, Madeline concluded that the proof of her breaking permanent ties might be better seen by visiting relatives and friends before she went back east. With that in mind, she invited Helen to visit her during the summer and bring as many friends as she liked. No slight task, indeed, was it to oversee the many business details of Her Majesty's ranch, and to keep a record of them. Madeline found the course of business training upon which her father had insisted to be invaluable to her now. It helped her to assimilate and arrange the practical details of cattle raising as put forth by the blunt Stillwell. She split up the great stock of cattle into different herds, and when any of these were out running out in the open range, she had them closely watched. Part of the time each herd was kept in an enclosed range, fed and watered, and carefully handled by big forces of cowboys. She employed 3 cowboy scouts whose sole duty was to ride the ranges, seeking for strays, sick or crippled cattle or motherless calves, and to bring them in to be treated and nursed. There were 2 cowboys whose business was to master a pack of Russian stage hounds and to hunt down the coyotes, wolves, and lions that preyed upon the herds. The better, tamer cows were separated from the ranging herds and kept in a pasture adjoining the dairy. All branding was done in corrals, and calves were weaned from mothered cows at the proper time to benefit both. The old method of branding and classing that was so shocking to Madeline had been abandoned, and one had been adopted whereby cattle, cowboys, and horses were spared brutality and injury. Madeline established an extensive vegetable farm, and she planted orchards. The climate was superior to that of California, and with abundant water, trees and plants and gardens flourishing and blossoming in a way wonderful to behold. It was ever increasing pleasure that Madeline walked through the acres of grounds once bare, now green and bright and fragrant. There were poultry yards and big pens and marshy quarters for ducks and geese. Here in the farming section of the ranch, Madeline found employment for the little colony of Mexicans. Their lives had been as hard and barren as the dry valley where they lived, but as the valley had been transformed by the soft, rich touch of water, so their lives had been transformed by help and sympathy and work. The children were wrenching no more, and many that had been blind could now see, and Madeline had become to them a new and blessed virgin. Madeline looked abroad over these lands and likened the change in them, and those which lived by them, to the change in her heart. It may have been fancy, but the sun seemed to be brighter, the sky bluer, and the wind sweeter. Certainly, it was that deep green of grass and garden was not fancy, nor the white and pink of blossoms, nor the blaze or perfume of flowers, nor the shine off the lake, or in the fluttering of new-born leaves. Where there had been a monotonous gray, there was now vivid and changing color. Formerly there had been silence both day and night, and now during the sunny hours there was music. The whistle of prancing stallions pealed in on the grassy ridges. Innumerable birds had come, and like the northward journey ducks, they had tarried to stay. The song of the meadowlark and blackbird and robin, familiar to Madeline from childhood, mingled with the new and strange, heart-throbbing song of the mockingbird and the piercing blast of the desert eagle and the moaning of a turtle dove. One April morning, Madeline sat in her office wrestling with a problem. She had problems to solve every day. The majority of these were concerned with the management of the 27 incomprehensible cowboys. This particular problem involved Ambrose Mills, who had eloped with her French maid, Kristen. Stillwell faced Madeline with a smile almost as huge as his bulk.
"Well, Miss Majesty, we fetched 'em, but not before Padre Marcos had married them. All that speedin' in the automobile must have scared 'em me to death for nothing. I tell you, Link Stevens is crazy about running that car. Link never had no sense even with a hoss. He ain't afraid of the devil himself. If my hair hadn't been white, it'd be white now. No more rides in that thing for me. Well, we fetched that Ambrose and the girl too late, but we brought 'em back, and they're out there now, spooning, sure are oblivious to their shameless conduct."
Stillwell, what shall I say to Ambrose? How shall I punish him? He has done wrong to deceive me. I was never so surprised in my life. Christine did not seem to care any more for Ambrose than any of the other cowboys. What does my authority amount to? I must do something, Stillwell. You must help me. Whenever Madeline fell into a quandary, she had to call upon the old cattleman. No man ever held a position with greater pride than Stillwell, but he had been put to tests that steeped him in humility. Here he scratched his head in great perplexity.
Well, doggone the luck. What's that eloping business to do with cattle raising? I don't know nothing about cattle. Miss Majesty, it's amazingly strange what these cowboys have come to. I never seen no cowboy like this we got here now. I don't know them any more. They dress swell and read books, and some of them have actually stopped a cussin' and a drinkin'. I ain't saying all this is against them, though. Why, now they're just some of the finest bunch of cowboys I ever seen or dreamed of, but managing them now they're kind of beyond me. When cowboys begin to play that game of golf and running off with French maids, I reckon Bill Stillwell has got to resign.
Stillwell, you'll not leave me. What in the world would I do? Exclaimed Madeline in great angst.
Well, I won't leave you, Miss Majesty. No, I'd never do that. I'll run the cattle business for ye and see her about the horses and other stock. But I gotta have a foreman who can handle this amazingly strange bunch of cowboys.
You've tried a half-dozen foremans. Try more until you find the right one who meets your requirements, said Madeline. But never mind that now. Tell me how to impress Ambrose, to make him an example, so to speak. I must have another maid, and I do not want a new one carried off in this summary manner.
Well, if you fetch in more pretty maids out here, you can't expect nothing less. Why, that little black-eyed little French girl with her white skin and pretty hair and smiles and shrugs, she has the cowboys crazy. It'll be worse with the next one.
Oh, dear, sighed Madeline.
And as for impressing Ambrose, I reckon I can tell you how to do that. Just give it to him good and say you're going to fire him. That'll fix Ambrose and maybe scare the other boys for a spell.
Very well, Stillwell. Bring Ambrose to see me, and tell Kristen to wait in my room. It was a handsome, debonair, bright-eyed cowboy that came tramping into Madeline's presence. His customary shyness and awkwardness had disappeared in an excited manner. He was a happy boy. He looked straight into Madeline's face as if he expected her to wish him joy, and Madeline actually found that expression trembling to her lips. She held it back until she could be severe, but Madeline feared she would fail at much severity. Something warm and sweet, like a fragrance, had entered the room with Ambrose. "Ambrose, what have you done?" she asked. "Miss Hammond, I done and got married," replied Ambrose, his words tumbling one over another. His eyes snapped, and there was kind of a glow upon his clean-shaved brown cheek. "I done stole a march on the other boys. There was Frank Slade pushing me close, and I was having some run-ins to keep Jim Bell back in my dust. Even old man Nels made eyes at Kristen. So I wasn't going to be taking any chances. I just packed her off to El Cajon and got her married." "Oh, so I've heard," said Madeline slowly as she watched him. "Ambrose, do you love her?" He reddened under her clear gaze and dropped his head and fumbled with his new sombrero, and there was a catch in his breath. Madeline saw his powerful brown hand tremble. It affected her strangely that this stalwart cowboy, who could rope and throw and tie a wild steer in less than a minute, should tremble at a mere question. Suddenly he raised his head, and at the beautiful blaze of his eyes Madeline turned her own.
"Yes, Miss Hammond, I do. I love her," he said. "I think I love her in the way that you're asking about. I know the first time I saw her I thought how wonderful it'd be to have a girl like that for a wife. It's all been so strange, her coming and how she made me feel. Sure, I never knew many girls, and I haven't seen any girls at all for years, but when she came, a girl makes a wonderful difference in a man's feelings and thoughts. I guess I never had any before. Leastways, none like I have now. Well, I guess I have a little understanding now of Padre Marco's blessing."
"Ambrose, have you nothing to say to me?" asked Madeline.
"I'm sure sorry I didn't have time to tell you, but I was in quite a hurry."
"What do you intend to do? Where were you going when Stillwell found you?"
We had just been married. I hadn't thought of anything after that. Suppose I'd have to rustle back to my job. I'd sure have to work now and save my money."
"Oh, well, Ambrose, I'm glad you realize your responsibilities. Do you earn enough? Is your pay sufficient to keep a wife?"
"Sure is. Why, Miss Hammond, I never before earned half the salary I'm getting now. It's some fine working for you. I'm going to fire the boys out of my bunkhouse and fix it up for Kristen and me. Say, won't they be jealous?"
"Ambrose, I congratulate you. I wish you joy," said Madeline. I shall make Kristen a little wedding present. I want to talk with Kristen for a few moments. You may go now."
It would have been impossible for Madeline to say one severe word to that happy cowboy. She experienced difficulty in hiding her own happiness at the turn of the events. Curiosity and interest mingled with her own pleasure when she called Kristen.
"Miss Ambrose Mills, come in."
No sound came from the other room.
"I should very much like to see the bride," went on Madeline.
Still there was no stir to reply.
"Kristen!"
called Madeline. And then it was as if a little whirlwind of flying feet and entreating hands and beseeching eyes blew upon Madeline. Kristen was small, graceful, and plump, with very soft white skin and very dark hair. She had been Madeline's favorite maid for years, and there was a sincere affection between the two. Whatever had been the blissful ignorance of Ambrose, it was manifestly certain that Kristen knew how she had transgressed. Her fear and remorse and appeal for forgiveness were poured out in an incoherent storm. Plain it was that the little French maid had been overwhelmed. It was only after Madeline had taken the emotional girl in her arms and forgiven and soothed her that her part in the elopement became clear. Kristen was in a maze. But gradually, as she talked and saw that she'd been forgiveness, calmness came in some degree, and with it a story which amused yet shocked Madeline. The unmistakable, shy, marveling love, scarcely realized by Kristen, gave Madeline relief and joy. If Kristen loved Ambrose, there was no harm done. Watching the girl's eyes, wonderful with their change of thoughts, listening to her attempt to explain what was evident she did not understand, Madeline gathered that if ever a caveman had taken unto himself a wife, if ever a barbarian had carried off a Sabine woman, then Ambrose Mills had acted with the violence of such ancient forebears. Just how it happened seemed to be beyond Kristen.
"He said he loved me,"
repeated the girl, in kind of a rapt awe.
"And he asked to marry. He kissed me and he hugged me, and he lifted me onto a horse, and he rode with me all night, and he married me."
And she showed a ring on the third finger of her left hand. Madeline saw that
Whatever had been the state of Kristen's feelings for Ambrose before this marriage, she certainly loved him now. She might have been taken slightly forcibly, but she was won. After Kristen was gone and comforted, and betrayed her shy eagerness to get back to Ambrose, Madeline was haunted by the look in the girl's eyes and her words. Assuredly, the spell of romance was on this sunny land. For Madeline, there was a nameless charm, a nameless thrill combating her sense of the violence and unfitness of Ambrose's wooing. Something, she knew not what, took arms against her intelligent arrangements of the cowboy's methods of getting himself a wife. He had said straight out that he loved the girl. He asked her to marry him. He kissed her and he hugged her. He left her upon her horse and he rode away with her throughout the night. And he married her. In whatever light Madeline reviewed this thing, she always came back to her first natural impression. It thrilled her and charmed her. It went against all the precepts of her training. Nevertheless, it was somehow splendid and beautiful. Scarcely had she settled back to the task on her desk when Stillwell's heavy tread across the porch interrupted her. This time, when he entered, he wore a look that bordered upon the historical. It was difficult to tell whether he was trying to suppress grief or glee.
"Miss Majesty, there's another strange thing sprung upon me. Here's Jim Bell come to see you, and when I taxed him, saying you was tolerable busy, he up and says he was hungry, and he wasn't going to be eating any more bread made in a wash basin. Says he'll starve first. Says Neil's had the gang over to his bunk and feasted them on bread you taught him how to make in that newfangled bucket machine with a crank. Jim says that bread beat any cake he ever ate, and he wants you to show him how to make some. Now, Miss Majesty, as superintendent of this ranch, I ought to know what's going on. Maybe Jim is just a joshing me, and maybe he's gone clear dotty. Maybe I have. And begging your pardon, I want to know if there's any truth to what Jim says about Neil saying."
Whereupon it became necessary for Madeline to stifle her mirth and to inform the sadly perplexed old cattleman that she had received from the East a patent bread mixer, and in view of the fact that her household women had taken fright at the contrivance, she had essayed to operate it herself. This had turned out to be so simple, so saving of time and energy and flour, so much more clean than the old method of mixing dough with the hands, and particularly it had resulted in such good bread that Madeline had been pleased. Immediately she ordered more of the bread mixers. One day she had happened upon Nels making biscuit dough in his wash basin, and she had delicately and considerately introduced him to the idea of her new method. Nels, it appeared, had a great reputation as a bread maker, and he was proud of it. Moreover, he was skeptical of any claptrap thing with wheels and cranks. He consented, however, to let her show how the thing worked and to sample some of the bread. And to that end, she had him come up to the house, where she won him over. Stillwell laughed long and loud. "Well, well, well," he exclaimed at length. "That's fine, and it's powerful funny. Maybe you don't quite see how funny. Well, Nels was just been lording it over the boys how you showed 'em, and now you have to show every last cowboy in the place the same thing. Cowboys be the jealousest kinds of fellers. They're all crazy about you anyway. You take Jim out here, why, that lazy old cow-puncher just never could make bread. He's notorious for shirking his share of the grub deal. I've known Jim trade off washing the pots and pans for a lonely watch on a rainy night. All he wants is you to show him the same as Nels is crowing over. Then he'll crow over his bunk, Frank Slade, and then Frank will get lonely to know all about this wonderful bread machine. Cowboys are amazing critters, Miss Majesty. And now that you've begun with them this way, you have to keep it up.
I will say I've never seen such a bunch of work. You sure put some heart into them."
"Indeed, Stillwell, I'm glad to hear that," replied Madeline, "and I'll be pleased to teach them all. But may I not have them all up here at once, at least those off duty?"
"Well, I reckon you can't unless you want to have 'em scrapping," rejoined Stillwell dryly. "What you got on your hands now, Miss Majesty, is to let 'em come up one by one and make each cowboy think you're taking some extra special pleasure in showing 'em that the other feller who come before 'em. Then maybe we can go on with the cattle raising."
Madeline protests, and Stillwell held strong to what he said was wisdom. Several times Madeline had gone against his advice, and to her utter discomfort en route, she dared not risk it again, and resigned herself gracefully and with subdued merit to his task. Jim Bell was ushered into the great, light, spotless kitchen, where presently Madeline appeared to put on an apron and roll up her sleeves. She explained the use of the several pieces of aluminum that made up the bread mixture and fastened the bucket to the table shelf. Jim's life might have depended upon this lesson, judging from his absorbed manner and his desire to have things explained over and over, especially the turning of the crank. When Madeline had to take Jim's hand 3 times to show him the simple mechanism, then he did not understand, she began to faint misgivings to his absolute sincerity. She guessed that as long as she touched Jim's hand, he would never have understood. And then, as she began to measure out flour and milk and lard and salt and yeast, she saw with despair that Jim was not looking at the ingredients, was not paying the slightest attention to him. His eyes were covertly upon her. "Jim, I am not so sure about you," said Madeline severely. "How can you learn to make bread if you do not watch me mixing it?"
I'm a-watching,"
replied Jim innocently. Finally, Madeline sent the cowboy on his way, rejoicing with the bread mixture under his arm. Next morning, true to Stillwell's prophecy, Frank Slade, Jim's bunkmate, presented himself cheerfully to Madeline, and unblossomed himself for a long deferring and persistent desire to relieve his overworked comrade of some of the housekeeping in their bunk.
"Miss Hammond," said Frank, "Jim's our'n kind want to do it all by himself, but he ain't very bright, and I didn't believe him. You see, I'm from Missouri, and you'll have to show me now."
For a whole week, Madeline held clinics where she expounded the scientific method of modern bread making. She got a good deal of enjoyment out of her lectures. What boys these great hulking fellers were. She saw through their simple ruses. Some of them were as grave as deacons. Others wore expressions important enough to fit the faces of statesmen signing government treaties. These cowboys were children. They needed to be governed, but in order to govern them, they had to be humored. A more light-hearted, fun-loving crowd of boys could never have been found. And they were grown men. Stillwell explained that the exuberance of spirit lay in the difference in their fortunes. 27 cowboys in relays of 9 worked 8 hours a day. That had never been heard of before in the West. Stillwell declared that cowboys from all points of the compass would head their horses towards Her Majesty's ranch. End of chapter 7.